Every doctor at New York Presbyterian had given up. The most feared Mafia boss on the East Coast, a man who had built a criminal empire with blood and bullets before he turned 30, lay in a private room guarded by armed men, connected to machines that beeped out the slow countdown to his death. 3 weeks after 3 bullets tore through Ronan Vale's body outside his own restaurant in Lower Manhattan, there was no brain activity beyond the most basic stem functions. His organs were beginning to fail, and his older brother had already signed the papers to pull the plug in 72 hours. The underworld was circling like wolves. His enemies were carving up his territory, and not a single person who visited that room came out of love, only fear or calculation. But every night, a 27-year-old cleaning woman named Lila Callahan would push her cart into room 1847 and do something no one else did. She talked to him, not because she knew he was a billionaire kingpin, not because she wanted anything from him, but because her grandmother had taught her an old Gaelic prayer and a simple belief that the soul can hear what the body cannot. Lila was barely surviving herself, an Irish-American single mother working 3 jobs to feed her little girl, Thea, carrying scars on her wrist from an abusive ex-husband who had thrown her down a staircase while she was 7 months pregnant, drowning in $12,400 of medical debt, 1 paycheck away from the street. She had every reason to keep her head down and mind her own business. But instead, she told this silent stranger about her daughter's first words, about the moon Thea pointed at every night, about the one-eyed stuffed rabbit they had found at a thrift store. And deep inside that endless gray fog of his coma, the most dangerous man in New York was holding on to her voice like a drowning man gripping a rope, because Lila's stories about Thea were the only points of light keeping his mind from slipping away forever. Then came the night that changed everything, when Lila had no choice but to bring her feverish, crying toddler to the hospital. In a moment of pure desperation, she laid little Thea on the chest of a man the whole world had already declared dead. What happened over the next 8 hours wasn't medicine, it wasn't science, and no doctor could ever explain it. If this story doesn't leave you speechless, nothing will. Hit that like button if you believe in miracles. Share this with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because sometimes the most powerful man in the room isn't the one holding the gun. It's the one holding a sleeping child. Declan Vale stood in the hospital corridor, his back against the cold white wall, his eyes lowered to the sleeves that still bore the dark, dried blood of his brother. Blood he hadn't bothered to change since that night. It had been 3 weeks, and he could still smell gunpowder, still hear tires screaming across wet asphalt, still see the moment Ronan collapsed on the sidewalk outside the restaurant in Lower Manhattan, his eyes wide open and fixed on the night sky, as if surprised that death could arrive in such an ordinary way. Declan had taken down both gunmen on the spot, 2 clean shots to the head. But when he dropped to his knees beside Ronan, blood was already pooling beneath his brother's back, and those gray eyes had closed. He had screamed for an ambulance, pressed both hands against Ronan's chest wound until the paramedics arrived. And from that night on, he hadn't left the hospital even once. Declan had known Ronan since they were both kids in the poor blocks of Red Hook, Brooklyn. He remembered the day Ronan was 14, standing in a grimy kitchen, watching their father's body being brought home with 2 bullets in his chest, a gift from Hector Voss after the old Vale had refused to give up the Southern Territory. Ronan didn't cry that day, didn't cry at the funeral, didn't cry when their mother died of grief just 1 year later. Instead, he quietly turned into something the entire neighborhood feared. At 16, Ronan held his first gun. At 18, he controlled 3 city blocks. At 21, he took over the entire northern Manhattan network. Before he turned 30, he had built the Vale Empire into the largest underground power on the East Coast through a combination of razor-sharp intelligence and merciless violence. But now that empire was cracking day by day. News of Ronan's coma spread faster than any bullet, and Hector Voss, the man who had killed their father 22 years earlier, smelled blood in the water. In the first week, Voss seized 2 southern territories with little resistance. In the second week, 3 longtime Vale allies quietly switched sides without announcements, simply by no longer answering Declan's calls. In the third week, revenue from the underground operations dropped by more than half, and those who once bowed to the Vale name began whispering that the era was over. Declan stood outside room 1847 every day watching the visitors. Capos came to ask who would take power if the boss died, their eyes calculating rather than mournful. Business partners arrived to confirm rumors, then walked out with phones to their ears, calling lawyers or Voss. Restaurant managers came to ask who would sign payroll checks this month. The beautiful women who once surrounded Ronan at parties vanished without a trace, as if they had never existed. Not a single genuine tear, not a single sincere prayer. No one came because they missed Ronan, because they loved Ronan, because they wanted him to live. The luxurious hospital room, with its view of Central Park, fresh flowers replaced daily by the hospital, spotless sheets, and the most advanced machines money could buy, felt colder than any morgue Declan had ever entered. At least, in a morgue, someone came to cry. In this room, the room of the most powerful man in New York, no one cried at all. Declan stood there every night staring through the glass panel in the door, and the only thing keeping him from collapsing was the image of a small cleaning woman pushing her cart into the room each evening, pulling up a chair beside the bed and talking to his brother as if he were still there. Declan didn't understand why she did it, but he knew that in those 3 weeks, that woman was the only visitor to enter room 1847 without ambition or fear, carrying nothing but her voice and a kindness he had thought extinct long ago in their world. Declan Vale arrived at the hospital the following morning in a perfectly tailored gray suit, his hair neatly styled, his face revealing no emotion at all, looking more like a chief financial officer heading into a board meeting than a brother slowly losing his younger sibling. At 41, Declan was the polished face of the Vale empire, the man who managed the upscale restaurant chain, the real estate company, and the legitimate investments the family used to launder underground money. He didn't carry a gun, didn't sit in smoke-filled back rooms negotiating territory, and for 10 years he had told Ronan more times than he could count that violence only led to one inevitable ending. Ronan always smiled and told him to worry about the books and leave the streets to him. Now his brother lay there, and Declan hated himself because the first thing that crossed his mind wasn't grief, but who would authorize this week's transfers. Dr. Elena Hart waited for him in a small conference room at the end of the hall, surrounded by brain scans and vital charts she knew Declan wouldn't understand but still presented, because that was protocol. She spoke briefly and plainly, in the way only doctors accustomed to death can speak, saying there were no signs of recovery. The internal organs were failing faster than expected, and even if by some miracle he woke up, the brain damage would mean he'd no longer be the man Declan once knew. Declan listened, nodded once, then signed the stack of papers he had known he would have to sign from the moment he stepped into the hospital. 72 hours after that, they would remove the ventilator. He left the conference room, walked down the corridor, nodded to Sullivan standing outside room 1847 as he did every day, then stepped into the elevator. He didn't go in to see Ronan. He couldn't, because if he saw his brother lying there with tubes and beeping machines, he might not be strong enough to do what had to be done next. Declan sat in the black Mercedes in the hospital's underground garage for a long time. He didn't start the engine, didn't turn on music, didn't make any calls. He just sat there, both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight at the concrete wall ahead. He thought of Ronan at 14 standing in the kitchen, looking at their father's body without crying. And he thought of himself at 19, standing right beside him and not crying either, because Vale brothers weren't allowed to cry. Their father had taught them that before he died, and now Declan had just signed papers for his brother to die while his eyes remained dry. and he hated himself for that more than anything he had ever done in his life. 20 minutes later, he started the engine and drove to the family's private restaurant in Tribeca, where 4 capos were already waiting around the round table behind the kitchen. The meeting was fast, cold, and practical, like every business meeting Declan had ever run. He laid out the situation. Ronan wouldn't survive. The empire needed a new head, and the transition had to happen quietly and in order before Voss could react. 2 capos nodded immediately. They'd been waiting for this meeting since the previous week. One asked who would replace him and glanced at Declan with a look that mixed calculation and hope. But Sullivan Reed jumped to his feet from the corner of the room where he'd been sitting silently from the start and said his boss wasn't dead yet, that 72 hours hadn't passed, and that anyone who wanted to talk about replacing Ronan Vale while he was still breathing should say it directly to Sullivan first. The room fell silent for a few seconds. Declan looked at Sullivan and said loyalty was admirable, but reality was reality. Then he continued the meeting as if Sullivan didn't exist. Sullivan walked out, punched the hallway wall until his knuckles bled, then drove back to the hospital because he didn't know where else to go. When Sullivan stepped out of the elevator on the private ward floor, he saw it immediately. A large funeral wreath of white lilies stood right in front of room 1847, with a small card written in elegant italic letters offering deepest condolences from Hector Voss. Ronan wasn't dead yet. Voss had already sent funeral flowers, not by mistake, but as a declaration, a slap in the face of the entire Vale family, a way of saying that in his eyes, Ronan was already dead and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Sullivan stared at the wreath for 3 seconds, then lifted it with one hand, walked to the end of the corridor, and threw it into a stainless steel trash bin with a crash that echoed across the floor. 2 guards standing watch looked at him, but neither spoke. White lily petals scattered across the hallway floor like out-of-season snow. And Sullivan stood there among the fallen petals, breathing hard, wondering whether he was guarding a living man or standing watch at the door of a dead one. While the New York underworld reeled from Voss's funeral wreath and the power transfer meeting in the Tribeca restaurant, more than an hour away by subway, in a cramped studio apartment on the 5th floor of a worn-down building in the Bronx, Lila Callahan was sitting on the kitchen floor pressing a small adhesive bandage onto Thea's knee after the little girl tripped over a table leg. She realized it was the last bandage in the box. She'd have to remember to buy more if there was anything left after paying the electricity bill. And she knew there wouldn't be, but that was something she'd deal with later, because Lila Callahan was used to pushing everything to tomorrow until tomorrow piled up into a wall she couldn't climb. She was 27, but her life already felt as long as someone who had lived 60 years. Her mother, Mary Callahan, was the only person in the world who had ever told Lila she deserved to be loved. And she died of breast cancer when Lila was 17, dying on the cheapest hospital bed insurance would cover in a shared room with 3 other patients. And the last thing she did was hold Lila's hand and whisper a Gaelic prayer her own mother had taught her, then tell Lila to remember that prayer because there would come a time when she'd need it more than anything else in the world. Her father, Patrick Callahan, was a man Lila remembered only through the smell of cheap whiskey and the sound of a door slamming shut at midnight. He left when Lila was 9, leaving behind nothing but unpaid bills and a daughter who learned that men would leave. Always. The family in Ireland, the relatives her mother used to call every Christmas, cut contact after Mary died, not out of cruelty, but because poverty on both sides of the Atlantic didn't allow them to maintain relationships that brought no practical benefit. Lila was 17, motherless, abandoned by her father, alone in the world. And when Kyle Morrison appeared at the diner where she washed dishes with a wide smile and warm hands that pulled her close, Lila believed God had finally heard her prayers. Kyle was 6 years older, a plumber, earning enough to rent a 1-bedroom apartment in Yonkers. And for the first 6 months, he was the kindest man Lila had ever known. Then the next 6 months, he became a nightmare. It started with words, sharp, cutting remarks about her stupidity, about the way she cooked, the way she laughed, the way she breathed. Then came the first slap, which Kyle called an accident and cried while apologizing for 2 hours. Then came the second, without an apology. Then the third, the fourth, the fifth, until Lila stopped counting and stopped wanting to count. When Lila discovered she was pregnant, she believed the baby would change Kyle, because that's what all desperate women tell themselves. But Kyle didn't change. He just found more reasons to be angry. That night, when Lila was 7 months pregnant, she told Kyle she wanted to leave because she was afraid for the baby, and Kyle pushed her. It wasn't the hardest push he had ever given, but she was standing at the top of the stairs, and 12 wooden steps don't require much force to destroy everything. Lila fell, her body twisting in midair, and her only instinct was to curl around her swollen belly with both arms, letting her back and wrists slam into each step instead of the baby. She lay at the bottom of the stairs in too much pain to breathe, blood soaking her clothes, her left wrist broken and swelling purple. And Kyle stood at the top of the stairs, looked down at her, then walked out and closed the door. Lila lay there, alone on the cold wooden floor, one hand clutching her belly, the other limp and broken at her side. And she began to recite the Gaelic prayer her mother had taught her grandmother had taught her, repeating it again and again until a neighbor heard her moans and called an ambulance. Thea was born 2 months early by emergency surgery at Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx, weighing less than 2 kilograms, so small she fit into a single adult hand. Lila lay on the operating table staring at the white ceiling, asked the nurse if Kyle had come, and the nurse shook her head with the look of pity Lila knew all too well. Kyle didn't come that day, didn't come the next, didn't come ever again. He vanished the way her father had vanished, leaving behind a long scar on her left wrist and a baby girl who had to lie in an incubator for 3 weeks before she was strong enough to go home. When Lila held Thea for the first time, the baby was so small she was afraid she'd break her just by breathing. And she whispered the Gaelic prayer to her daughter, telling her they would be all right, even though she didn't know how. From then on, every morning she woke at 4, fed Thea, laid her in the crib, worked an early shift at the hospital, came home to feed her, worked an afternoon shift at the laundromat, came home to put her to sleep, then worked a night shift cleaning offices. Not because she was brave, Lila never thought of herself as brave, she simply had no choice but to stand up, because if she lay down, Thea would have no one, and she'd rather die than let her daughter grow up alone in the world the way she had. While Lila rose each day for her little daughter in the outside world somewhere no one could reach, Ronan Vale was drifting. Not drifting like floating on water or drifting in a dream, but drifting in nothingness, a vast gray expanse with no up or down, no before or after, no pain yet no sensation, no fear yet no peace. There was simply nothing. Ronan didn't know how long he had been there, didn't know who he was, didn't know whether he was alive or dead, and most of the time he didn't care, because nothingness held a power violence never had. It rendered everything gently meaningless, so gentle you didn't even bother to resist. Sometimes sounds pierced the fog, but most were empty and cold. The voice of a woman spoke words Ronan didn't understand, something about brain activity and brainstem function and prognosis. A voice carrying the scent of disinfectant and the professional helplessness of someone accustomed to watching patients die. The voice of a man Ronan sensed was familiar, but couldn't place spoke of transitions and timelines and decisions, words sharp as knives cutting through the mist before vanishing without a trace. The voice of another man, younger, heavy with guilt and anger, said, "Boss, please wake up," said he couldn't hold everything alone, said he was sorry he hadn't been fast enough. And that voice made Ronan feel heavier, as if someone were pulling him deeper instead of hauling him up. Then there was a fourth voice. This one was different from all the others. It carried no medical terms, no strategic calculations, no guilt or regret. This voice told stories. It spoke of a little girl who learned a new word today. The word was Luna. and the child pointed at the sky and laughed. And Ronan didn't know what Luna was, but the way the voice shaped the word made him feel it had to be something beautiful. It spoke of a stuffed rabbit missing one eye that the child hugged to sleep every night, of the way the girl held her mother's hand on the street and pointed at everything with a tiny finger, asking, "What is that?" again and again without stopping. Sometimes the voice spoke of sad things, of exhaustion, of fear, of long, sleepless nights. But even in sadness, the voice carried something Ronan couldn't find in any other sound: warmth. Real warmth. Not the warmth of flattery or obligatory loyalty or conditional affection, but the warmth of someone speaking to him for no reason other than believing he deserved to hear a kind voice. Ronan didn't know who the voice belonged to, didn't know what she looked like, didn't know what she was to him, but whenever it appeared, the gray fog seemed to thin just a little. And whenever it faded, the darkness grew heavier, and Ronan drifted farther away in the nothingness where everything was meaningless. That voice was the only thread Ronan still held, and he clung to it with the deepest instinct he had left, the instinct that even a coma couldn't erase, the instinct of someone about to drown who knows that if he lets go, there won't ever be a second chance. That evening, Lila came to the hospital for her shift, as she did every night, pushing her janitor's cart down the corridor of the private ward. And before she could turn toward room 1847, Nurse Evelyn stepped out from the nurse's station and stopped her. Evelyn was a middle-aged woman with silver hair who always carried peppermint candies in her pocket and sometimes quietly slipped Lila a carton of milk from the staff cafeteria without saying a word, the kind of silent kindness that comes from working in a hospital long enough to understand that sometimes a free carton of milk matters more than any comfort speech. But tonight Evelyn carried no peppermint candies and no milk. She carried bad news, and she drew Lila aside into a corner of the hallway and told her as gently as she could that the family had decided that in 72 hours they would remove the breathing tube from the patient in room 1847. And Evelyn thought Lila should know because she'd seen her talk to the patient every night for the past 3 weeks. Lila stood there with her hand still resting on the handle of the janitor's cart, and she cried. Not sobbing, not making any sound, just tears running down both cheeks that she didn't bother to wipe away. And she didn't understand why she was crying. She didn't know the man's real name until the second week, when she read it on the chart at the foot of the bed. Didn't know what he did, where he lived, whether he had any real family or friends. She only knew that for 3 weeks she'd told him everything she never told anyone else, about Thea, about fear, about long nights, about the small, fragile hope she hid in her chest, as if speaking it aloud would make it disappear. And now the only person in the world who knew all of that was about to be gone. Lila wiped her eyes with her sleeve and asked Evelyn if she could go into the room one last time, just for a few minutes. And Evelyn nodded and turned away so Lila wouldn't feel ashamed of her tears. Lila stepped into room 1847, left the janitor's cart in the hallway, and for the first time she didn't clean, didn't wipe surfaces, didn't change the trash bag. She simply pulled the white plastic chair close to the bed and sat down. The room looked the same as every night. The steady beeping of machines, the soft lighting, the scent of disinfectant mixed with clean laundry. The 2 guards outside the door paid no attention to her. They were used to the small janitor woman pushing her cart into the room every night and quietly pushing it back out. Lila studied Ronan's face, really studied it for the first time since she'd started cleaning this room. He was 36, but he had the lines around his eyes of a man in his 50s. And on his left cheek there was a faint scar about 2 finger lengths long that she guessed came from a knife. And on his neck there was another scar, smaller and rounder, that she didn't want to guess the origin of. But beneath those scars, beneath the harsh angles of his jaw and brows, Lila saw a tired face, tired down to the bone. The kind of exhaustion that didn't come from 3 weeks in a coma, but from a lifetime without rest. The kind of exhaustion she saw every morning in the mirror when she looked at herself. and she thought that maybe before lying in this hospital bed, this man had never truly lived either, that he had only been surviving day by day just like her. Only he survived in a penthouse, and she survived in a studio in the Bronx. But loneliness didn't care about zip codes. Lila leaned closer and began to speak. Her voice a whisper meant only for herself to hear. She said she was sorry. Sorry that no one could save him. Sorry that this world treated people as if they only mattered while they were still useful. She told him about the invisible thread, the thing her grandmother taught her mother and her mother taught her, that every soul in the world is connected by threads the eye can't see. And when one person gently pulls a thread somewhere else, another person will feel it. And she said she'd been pulling this thread for 3 weeks now, and she didn't know if he could feel it, but she hoped he could. Then Lila placed her hand on Ronan's forehead, closed her eyes, and whispered the Gaelic prayer passed down from her grandmother to her mother and from her mother to her. Ancient syllables flowing softly through the quiet room, as if they belonged there, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment through generations to be spoken. She held Ronan's hand one last time, her rough, cracked hand wrapping around his larger, warmer one, and she held it for a long time before letting go, standing up, pushing the chair back where it belonged, and walking out of the room without looking back, because she knew that if she did, she wouldn't have the strength to leave. Lila opened the door to the studio apartment on the 5th floor of the Bronx building just before midnight, flipped on the fluorescent light, and the bulb flickered 3 times before finally staying on. A pale white glare that made everything in the room look worse than it really was, even though reality was bad enough already. She set her keys on the particle board table by the door, one leg propped up with an old phone book, kicked off her worn sneakers, and stepped into the kitchen to open the refrigerator. Inside were half a carton of milk close to expiring, a piece of cheese wrapped in foil, 3 eggs, and a pitcher of filtered water. She closed the fridge gently, as if shutting it harder might make the few things inside vanish. By the bed, Thea was sitting on the floor amid a pile of pillows and blankets, clutching the one-eyed stuffed rabbit in her arms, her big round eyes watching her mother come in. Mrs. Park had gone back to her own place at the end of the hallway around 9 after feeding Thea dinner of white rice and fried egg. And since then, Thea had waited alone in the locked apartment without crying, because she was used to it, not yet 2 years old and already accustomed to waiting, to her mother always leaving and always coming back, and knowing that her mother would return was enough. Lila sat down on the floor beside her, and Thea tilted her head and looked at her with eyes too old for her age and asked, "Mama sad?" in a tiny, clear voice. And Lila tried to smile and said, "No, Mama was just tired." But her eyes were still red from leaving room 1847, and she knew she wasn't fooling anyone, not even a child not yet 2. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Lila pulled it out and felt the blood in her veins turn cold. Kyle Morrison. 2 years without a sign. 2 years of slowly starting to believe he was truly gone. And now his name appeared on the cracked screen of her phone like a ghost from a nightmare she thought she'd woken up from. The message was short, cold, and calculated down to every word. He said he'd spoken to a lawyer, that he would file for custody because he'd heard she left the child alone at night to go to work, and that was grounds for the court to reconsider, and that if she wanted to resolve it quietly, she should call him back. Lila knew Kyle had a domestic violence record, knew that with that record, almost no court in New York would grant him custody. Knew this was nothing more than cheap extortion by a coward. But Lila also knew something else that Kyle knew better than anyone. To respond to a lawsuit, she needed a lawyer, and family lawyers in New York charged between $300 and $500 an hour. And even if she won, legal fees would still land somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 that she didn't have, had never had, and had no idea when she ever would. Kyle didn't want Thea. Kyle had never wanted Thea. He wanted money or power or to see Lila afraid, or all three at once, and the worst part was that it was working. Lila sat on the floor staring at the message until the letters blurred with tears, then deleted it with trembling fingers as if erasing it would make it not real, set the phone face down on the floor, and pulled Thea into her arms and held her tight. The child didn't understand what was happening, but the instincts of a child raised in instability made Thea fall silent and hug her mother back with both small arms, one hand still gripping the ear of the one-eyed stuffed rabbit. Lila cried without sound, the kind of crying she had mastered after years of practice, shoulders shaking, breath breaking, but not a single noise escaping because she didn't want Thea to hear. And as she sat there on the cold studio floor with her daughter in her arms, she thought of the $12,400 in hospital debt from 2 months earlier when Thea was admitted with pneumonia at Lincoln Hospital. 3 nights in the pediatric emergency unit, IV fluids, antibiotics, chest x-rays. And when the bill arrived, Lila had nearly fainted because Medicaid had denied a large portion due to a paperwork error, a single box she'd forgotten to check on the renewal form, a small, stupid mistake she hadn't had time to catch because that day she'd been running between 3 jobs and feeding Thea on a bus. And now that mistake had become $12,400 in debt, with a collections agency calling every week in the same polite, robotic voice. Lila held Thea tighter and closed her eyes, and she felt the edge right beneath her feet. Not a metaphorical edge, but a real one. The kind where one more push would send her falling and there would be no one to catch her. Thea started coughing at 2 a.m, a dry, rasping sound like stones grinding together inside her tiny chest, and by 3, her little body was burning so hot that Lila pressed a hand to her forehead and flinched away. Lila didn't have a thermometer because the old one had run out of batteries the month before, and she hadn't been able to buy a new one. But she didn't need a thermometer to know this fever was worse than the others. Thea lay on the bed with her eyes tightly shut, cheeks flushed, sweat soaking her thin hair, occasionally letting out a soft moan before another coughing fit seized her and curled her small body inward. Lila ran to the kitchen, turned on the cold tap, soaked a cloth, ran back to lay it on her daughter's forehead, flipped it, soaked it again, laid it back down, repeating the cycle from 3 to 4 in the morning in the silent apartment, broken only by her child's coughing and the drip of water from the wet cloth. She gave Thea half the last dose of children's fever medicine left in the bottle, tipping it carefully to catch every drop, then sat against the wall, holding her and waiting for it to work. By 4, the fever eased slightly, but the coughing didn't stop, and Lila sat there watching the sky begin to lighten through the dirty window, while her mind spun through calculations with no answers. It was Sunday. Mrs. Park had said the day before that she was going to Queens to visit her daughter and granddaughter and wouldn't be back until late evening. No Mrs. Park meant no one to watch Thea. Lila had no close friends in this building, no family in this city, no one in the world except the kind Korean neighbor who had gone to Queens. The free clinic on Willis Avenue, where Lila usually took Thea whenever she was sick, was closed on Sundays and wouldn't reopen until Monday. Taking her to the emergency room meant another bill she couldn't afford, piled on top of the $12,400 already crushing her. Lila's phone buzzed at 4:15. The hospital shift supervisor called, her voice tired and pleading, saying the flu had knocked out 3 more members of the night cleaning crew, and they were desperately short-staffed, asking if Lila could take the Sunday shift from 6 in the evening to 6 in the morning. Lila said she couldn't. Her child was sick. The supervisor was silent for a second, then said the 2 words she knew Lila couldn't refuse: double pay. Lila closed her eyes. Double pay for a 12-hour shift meant enough to cover this month's rent that the landlord had already reminded her about twice. It meant enough to buy fever medicine and antibiotics if Thea needed them. It meant keeping a roof over their heads for another 30 days before the next crisis. It meant not being thrown out into a New York winter with a feverish toddler in her arms. Lila opened her eyes and looked at Thea sleeping on the bed, cheeks still red, one hand gripping the ear of the one-eyed stuffed rabbit, her breathing heavy but steadier now that the medicine had taken hold. She told the supervisor she'd come in. Then she sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, watching her daughter sleep, hating herself for the decision but knowing it wasn't really a decision at all. It was surrender to the kind of arithmetic poor people are forced to solve every day, equations where every answer is wrong, and you can only choose the one that's the least wrong. At 5 p.m, Lila bathed Thea in warm water, dressed her in the cleanest pajamas she had, gave her a little cough syrup she found in the back of the cabinet that was 2 months past expiration but better than nothing. She wrapped Thea in the thickest blanket they owned, tucked the one-eyed stuffed rabbit into her hand, pulled a knit hat down over her head, and lifted her onto her shoulder. Thea didn't cry. She just rested her head against her mother's neck and breathed hot through her shirt. And Lila left the studio apartment, locked the door, walked down 5 flights of stairs because the elevator had been broken since the week before, stepped out onto the street, caught a bus in the February cold cutting into their faces, and headed toward New York Presbyterian Hospital with her sick child in her arms and nothing else in her coat pocket but her apartment key and her janitor's employee badge. Lila arrived at the hospital at 6 p.m, carrying Thea in her arms and entering through the employee door at the back of the building to avoid being seen. And the first thing she did was go to the staff break room in the basement, a small room with 2 green vinyl benches, an old wooden table, a microwave, and a pot of coffee someone had brewed on the previous shift and forgotten to throw out. She spread the blanket she had brought over the bench against the wall, gently laid Thea down, propped her head on a folded jacket as a pillow, tucked the one-eyed stuffed rabbit into her arms, then stepped back and looked at her. Thea lay curled on the bench, so small that more than half of it was still empty, her cheeks flushed with fever, her breathing still heavy, but she had fallen asleep on the bus and hadn't woken. Lila took a deep breath and went upstairs to clock in. And from that moment, the battle between the mother and the janitor began. She cleaned rooms on the 3rd floor every 15 minutes, setting the mop aside and running down to the basement to check on Thea, then running back up to continue. She cleaned rooms on the 5th floor, 15 minutes down, 15 minutes up, her legs aching from the stairs. But she didn't dare take the elevator for fear of running into a supervisor and having to explain why she was breathless and sweating through her clothes in the middle of winter. Every time she opened the break room door, she held her breath until she saw Thea still lying there, still breathing, still clutching the stuffed rabbit. And every time she had to fight the instinct to scoop her up and run home. By 9 p.m, Thea woke and began to fuss. The fever spiked again, her little face burning hot, her eyes glassy and unfocused, and she started calling Mama in a fragile voice, repeating it like a prayer, where the only word she knew was her mother's name. Lila rushed down and gathered her up, wiped her face and hands and feet with a damp cloth, gave her warm water from a bottle, and sat there rocking her until Thea drifted back to sleep, then laid her down again and ran back upstairs to keep cleaning. Another night janitor passed the break room and saw Thea, but said nothing, only looked at Lila with the knowing gaze of someone from the same life and kept walking, because everyone on the night cleaning crew carried a similar story. Everyone had a child at home or a sick relative they had to set aside to come to work, and no one had the heart to judge. At 11 at night, Lila looked at the room assignment list and saw room 1847. She stood staring at that number for a long time, remembering that tomorrow night, when the 72 hours were over, that room would be empty, the sheets changed, the machines removed, and the man she had talked to for 3 weeks would no longer be there. This was the last time she would clean that room while he was still breathing. She looked down the stairwell toward the basement, thought of Thea lying alone down there with a fever and her stuffed rabbit, and decided she couldn't leave her alone any longer. Not one more minute. Not losing her job didn't matter. Getting fired didn't matter. She wasn't going to leave her daughter lying alone in a cold hospital basement break room while she mopped floors. Lila ran downstairs and lifted Thea up, the child burning hot and limp against her shoulder, then carried her up to the private ward, pushing the janitor's cart with one hand and holding her child with the other. When she reached room 1847, the two night guards looked at her and then at the child on her shoulder. She had cleaned this room every night for 3 weeks. They knew her face, knew she was harmless, and the older guard glanced at the sleeping child and shifted aside just enough to let her pass without saying a word. Lila stepped into room 1847 for the last time, and the room was the same as every night, the steady beeping of the machines counting down the time Ronan Vale had left, the soft amber light, the stillness so deep she could hear Thea's heavy breathing against her shoulder, blending with the monitor's rhythm like two mismatched melodies, accidentally playing the same song. Lila began cleaning the room with one hand, the other holding Thea against her hip, and she was used to doing everything one-handed since Thea was born, so wiping tables or changing trash bags wasn't the problem. But Thea was, because the fever made the child restless and uncomfortable, and she refused to stay still anywhere. Lila tried setting Thea on the plastic chair in the room, but the child cried the moment her back touched the cold surface, cried louder when Lila placed her on the visitor sofa, and screamed when Lila tried patting the floor with a blanket, the dry, rasping cry of a feverish child tearing through the quiet room and sending panic through Lila because she knew if the guards outside heard it, she'd be in trouble. And if a supervisor found out she had brought a sick toddler into a patient's room, she'd be fired on the spot. Lila stood in the middle of the room with Thea crying in her arms, sweat running down her temples, scanning desperately for anywhere at all, warm enough and soft enough for Thea to settle, and her eyes landed on Ronan. He lay there on the hospital bed, his chest rising and falling steadily with the ventilator, his large body warm beneath the white sheets. And Lila knew this was the most reckless thought she had ever had, but she had no other choice. She whispered an apology and gently placed Thea on Ronan's chest, just to rest her arms for 1 minute. Just 1 minute while she wiped the table and she'd pick her up right away. Thea touched Ronan's chest and stopped crying, not slowly calming but stopping instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. The child lay there for a second, then another, then slowly curled inward like a kitten, finding warmth, pressing her fever-hot cheek against Ronan's chest just above his heart, her tiny hands clutching the fabric of his hospital gown. And for the first time all day, Thea slept, truly slept, her breathing slowing and evening out, her face easing out of pain, as if the chest of this comatose man was the safest place she had ever known. Lila stood frozen, afraid to breathe. She waited 10 seconds, 20, then bent to lift Thea. And the moment her hand touched the child, Thea screamed again instantly and reflexively, and Lila hurriedly placed her back on Ronan's chest. And the child fell silent, curling up, gripping the gown, sleeping on. Lila tried a third time, lifted her, cried, set her down. Silence. A fourth time, lifted her, cried, set her down. Silence. She didn't dare try a fifth. Lila pulled a chair beside the bed, her eyes never leaving Thea sleeping on Ronan's chest, guarding the scene like a miracle she didn't understand and didn't dare believe. And when she was sure Thea was deeply asleep and safe, she began to tell stories as she did every night, her voice a whisper just loud enough to hear herself, telling them to both of them, to the child sleeping on the chest and to the man sinking in darkness beneath. She said today had been the worst day in a long line of bad days, spoke of Thea's fever, of the night bus in the cold, of the helplessness of not being able to protect her child from things as simple as illness and poverty. Then she spoke of the moon Thea pointed to every night on the walk home, of how the child said Luna, clearly and proudly, as if it were the most important word in the world, and she said that maybe for Thea it truly was. Because the moon was always there. Every night it was there. It never left. 1 hour passed, then 2, and Lila stayed there telling stories. and she didn't notice right away, but something in the room was changing. The beeping of the heart monitor began to shift. No longer the flat, steady rhythm of every other night, but a little faster, just a little, then slowing, then quickening again, as if the heart were trying to remember how to beat on its own rather than on the machine's command. Lila looked up at the monitor, at first thinking her eyes were blurring from exhaustion. But no, the heart rate line was rippling differently, and the blood pressure numbers were inching upward. Deep within the endless gray fog, Ronan felt something he hadn't felt in 3 weeks. Something rested on his chest. Light, barely there, yet warm. Truly warm. Not the vague warmth of memory or hallucination, but warmth with weight, with rhythm, with breath. A tiny heartbeat fluttered against him, twice as fast as his own, quick and fragile like a butterfly's wings inside his chest, and Ronan sensed it through every layer of coma and nothingness. Then came the smell, warm milk and talc and child sweat, a scent he'd never known because he'd never been close to a child long enough to learn what they smelled like. Yet the deepest instinct in him recognized it instantly. Then came the hand, a tiny hand gripping his gown with the weak yet determined grasp of a sleeping child. And that grasp pulled Ronan toward the light more powerfully than any drug or medical technology ever invented. For the first time in 3 weeks, Ronan didn't just hear, but felt. Didn't just drift, but clung. Didn't just exist in nothingness, but wanted to leave it. The familiar voice was still there, speaking of the moon, drawing him closer, but it was the warmth on his chest that forced him to choose between letting go and holding on. At 4 in the morning, the index finger of Ronan Vale's right hand twitched, a small movement too slight to notice unless someone was watching closely, but Lila was holding his hand and she felt it. She stopped breathing, her heart racing, her eyes locked on his hand, waiting, and the finger moved again. Then the whole hand gently closed around her finger. Lila pressed the call button with her free hand, the other refusing to let go, and then Ronan opened his eyes. Ronan Vale's eyes opened for the first time in 3 weeks, and the world he saw wasn't a white ceiling or harsh hospital lights, but a blurred, shapeless chaos, like looking through murky water, everything bleeding together into meaningless streaks of light and shadow. He didn't know where he was, didn't know who he was, didn't know how much time had passed, and his body felt heavy as lead, every finger movement demanding an effort he wasn't sure he possessed. But he felt 2 things more clearly than any image before his eyes: the warmth on his chest and the voice beside him. His vision slowly focused, and the first thing Ronan saw clearly was a thin crown of light brown hair just beneath his chin, a tiny head resting on his chest, a small hand no bigger than half his palm gripping the edge of his hospital gown, a child, the child from the stories the voice had told him every night. Ronan didn't know her name, didn't know what she looked like until this moment. But he knew this was the child who loved the moon, the child who slept clutching a one-eyed stuffed rabbit, the child that voice loved more than anything in the world. And somehow that child was lying on his chest, and her light breathing was the thread that had pulled him back from nothingness. Ronan shifted his eyes to the side and saw her, the woman sitting on the white plastic chair beside the bed, thin auburn hair hastily tied back, green eyes swollen and red, tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't bother to wipe away, the owner of the voice. Ronan tried to speak, but his throat was dry and rigid after 3 weeks of disuse, and his lips only moved without sound. Lila hit the nurse call button again, this time over and over, and in less than a minute the quiet room turned into a storm. The on-duty nurse rushed in, saw Ronan's open eyes, froze for a second in disbelief, then spun around and ran into the hallway, shouting for the attending doctor. Another nurse rushed in, then 2, then 3. The lights flared bright. Someone rolled in a cart of equipment. Someone checked the monitors. Someone called doctor. Elena Hart at home at 4 in the morning with a trembling voice saying, "Doctor, the patient in room 1847 is awake. Yes, truly awake, eyes open and responsive." In the chaos, one nurse noticed Thea lying on Ronan's chest and stepped forward to lift the child away because this was a serious violation, an unidentified child on an intensive care patient's bed. And as her hand slid under Thea, Ronan's hand rose, slow, shaking, weak to the point of barely having strength, but deliberate and clear. His hand settled on Thea's back, shielding her, holding her there, and his cloudy gray eyes fixed on the nurse with a look that, even from a hospital bed after 3 weeks in a coma, made her stop and step back. It was Ronan Vale's first conscious movement in 3 weeks, and he used it not to touch his own face, not to reach for the call button, not to do anything for himself, but to keep a child he had never met lying safely on his chest. Thea didn't wake. She slept through the chaos, through the running footsteps and urgent voices and blazing lights, still curled on Ronan's chest with her hand clutching his gown, and his hand, 4 times the size of hers, rested on her back like a promise he wasn't yet awake enough to understand, but he was making. The 2 guards outside heard the commotion and burst in with guns drawn, saw their boss's eyes open, and the older one immediately stepped back into the hallway and pulled out his phone to call Sullivan Reed. Sullivan was sitting in his car in the hospital parking garage, where he had slept every night for 3 weeks because he didn't want to be more than a 5-minute walk from his boss. And when the phone rang at 4:12 in the morning, he answered on the first ring, because Sullivan Reed never let a phone ring to a second. He heard 3 words, and the phone slipped from his hand. Sullivan sat there staring into the darkness, his entire body shaking uncontrollably, the kind of shaking that comes when someone has held everything in for weeks and the body finally betrays him by releasing it all at once. He picked up the phone, dialed Declan with fingers shaking so badly he had to try 3 times. And when Declan answered with the irritated, half-asleep voice of a man woken at 4 in the morning, Sullivan managed to say only one sentence. "He's awake." There was silence on the line, a long silence, long enough that Sullivan thought the call had dropped. Then Declan spoke in a voice Sullivan had never heard from him before, a voice breaking at the edges of each word like water spilling through a cracked dam. "I'm coming now." Before dawn fully broke, news that Ronan Vale had awakened from his coma spread through the New York underworld faster than any bullet he had ever fired. From bars in Hell's Kitchen to nightclubs in the meatpacking district, from warehouses in Red Hook to penthouses on the Upper East Side, phones rang and messages flew, and reactions split cleanly in 2. Those who had stayed loyal breathed in relief, and those who had switched sides began to sweat cold. At the Staten Island mansion, Hector Voss was sitting in his oak-paneled study drinking red wine at 5 in the morning when his capo knocked and entered with a pale face and said, "Vale is awake." Voss said nothing for 3 seconds. Then he tightened his grip on the wine glass and squeezed until it shattered, red wine and blood mixing among the shards on the wooden desk. And he looked down at his bleeding hand without any change in his expression, because Hector Voss had just understood that the man he had declared dead with a wreath of white lilies wasn't dead at all, but would return. And when Ronan Vale returned, the first thing he would remember would be that wreath. In the days that followed, Ronan Vale recovered in a way Dr. Elena Hart called something I've never seen in any medical textbook I've ever read. His brain function returned almost completely. Cognitive abilities came back piece by piece, memory intact, language intact, motor function weak but improving daily, and she couldn't explain it with any scientific theory beyond a shrug and the admission that sometimes the human body does things medicine hasn't caught up with yet. The physical recovery was brutal. 3 weeks of immobility had wasted his muscles, and every attempt to sit up felt like being shot with 3 bullets all over again. But he endured it without complaint, because Ronan Vale had been stabbed, beaten, starved, and tortured enough times in real life to know that pain is just a signal from the body, and signals can be ignored. What he couldn't ignore was the memory of that night, blurred but certain. The warmth on his chest, the tiny heartbeat, the smell of milk, and the face of the woman crying beside his bed when he opened his eyes. On the third day after waking, when Ronan was strong enough to sit propped against pillows and speak without losing his breath, he called Sullivan into the room and asked in a hoarse but steady voice who the woman from that night was. Sullivan had been waiting for the question. He handed Ronan a thin file, the result of an investigation he had ordered the very morning Ronan woke, because Sullivan knew his boss and knew the first thing Ronan would ask wouldn't be about the Empire, wouldn't be about Voss, wouldn't be about territory or money, but about her. Lila Callahan, 27 years old, born in the Bronx, Irish-American, single mother, one daughter named Thea, nearly 2 years old, janitor at New York Presbyterian, evening and night shifts. Additional work at a laundromat on Fordham Road and office cleaning for a sanitation company in Midtown. Lives in a fifth-floor studio apartment in a building on Grand Concourse. No criminal record, no civil cases, no ties to any criminal organizations, no gambling debt, no drug involvement. Completely clean. So clean Sullivan had the check run twice, because in their world, no one that clean just happened to appear beside a boss's hospital bed. But she really was clean, really was a coincidence, really was just a janitor pushing a cart into the room every night and talking to a comatose man out of pure kindness. And Sullivan told Ronan, unable to hide his own disbelief, that she had no motive at all. She didn't know who his boss was. Ronan finished the file, folded it, set it on his stomach, and said, "Bring her here." Sullivan nodded and left. And 2 hours later, Lila Callahan stood at the door of room 1847 in her light blue janitor uniform, hair pulled into a ponytail, eyes lowered, hands clasped tightly in front of her stomach, because she didn't know what to do with them. A man in a suit had led her here and told her the patient in room 1847 wanted to see her, and Lila had followed because she didn't think she had the right to refuse. And now she stood at the threshold, looking into the room and seeing Ronan Vale awake for the first time. He was visibly thinner after 3 weeks, cheekbones sharper, eye sockets deeper. But those gray eyes were alive in a way that made Lila swallow and want to take a step back. They weren't the eyes of a fragile patient who had narrowly escaped death. They were the cold, sharp eyes of a man who had seen enough of the world to be surprised by nothing. And they were fixed on her without blinking, as if reading every page of her life. Lila stepped inside and the door closed behind her. The room was silent except for the monitor. Ronan studied her for a long time, and Lila met his gaze, and neither of them spoke for so long the air grew heavy. Then Ronan spoke, his voice still rough and slow, but each word clear. "You talk to me every night. Why?" Not a question, but a demand for explanation. The tone of a man used to giving orders rather than asking. Lila looked at him and answered more softly than she intended because her throat tightened. "Because no one else did. Every night I came in here to clean and you were lying there alone. No one talked to you. No one held your hand. And my grandmother taught me that the soul can hear what the body can't. So I talked to you because I thought maybe you needed to hear a voice that wasn't asking anything from you." Ronan didn't react right away. He kept looking at her for a few more seconds, then said the thing Lila wasn't prepared to hear. "I heard you. All of it. I heard about your daughter learning the word Luna. I heard about the one-eyed stuffed rabbit. I heard you talk about the worst night and the cold bus ride. I heard the prayer you whispered on my forehead. I heard everything, and your voice was the only thing that kept me from drifting away." Lila stood there as tears spilled down her face before she could stop them. Fast and heavy as if a valve had been opened, she couldn't find a way to close. And she cried, not from sadness, but because, for the first time in her life, someone told her her voice had value. that the small kindness she gave every night while the world wasn't looking had truly reached someone, that she wasn't invisible. Ronan watched her cry and said nothing more, offered no comfort, no thanks, because he didn't know how to do those things. But he didn't look away either, and for a man who had spent his entire life turning away from every emotion, the act of continuing to look at a woman crying in front of him without retreating was more than anyone had ever received from him. Outside the room, Sullivan Reed leaned against the wall, his right hand resting on the gun at his back out of reflex, his eyes watching through the small window in the door. He saw his boss, the man he had followed since childhood, the man he had seen kill with his bare hands and sign the destruction of rival families without a change in his breathing, looking at a janitor woman crying with eyes Sullivan had never seen on him before. Not calculating eyes, not cold eyes, not pitying or indifferent eyes, soft eyes. Sullivan Reed had walked beside Ronan Vale for 20 years, and he had never, not once, seen those gray eyes soften. And now they had softened for a thin woman in a janitor's uniform standing and crying in a hospital room. And Sullivan understood that something had happened during those 3 weeks of coma that no one in their world could understand. Something bigger than Ronan, simply waking up. After Lila left the hospital room that day, Ronan lay in silence for a long time, staring up at the ceiling, and then he called Sullivan in and said in a voice that left no room for questions that he wanted to know everything about her. Not a summary like last time. He wanted everything. Sullivan didn't ask why because he never asked why. He only nodded and left. And 2 days later, he returned with a file 3 times thicker than before. Ronan read every page from his hospital bed, and with each page he turned, his jaw tightened a little more. The first page detailed Kyle Morrison, 33 years old, a history of domestic violence, a restraining order that had expired 14 months earlier, currently living in Yonkers, a seasonal plumber addicted to alcohol and gambling. The second page contained the police report from the night Lila fell down the stairs, photographs of her injuries, a broken wrist, extensive bruising, emergency admission to Lincoln Hospital, an urgent cesarean section, a baby born 2 months premature. The third page showed threatening messages about filing for custody that Sullivan had managed to extract through the carrier, the cold, calculated language of a man who didn't want a child, but wanted to use a child as leverage for extortion. The fourth page listed the $12,400 in hospital debt from Thea's pneumonia admission, Medicaid denying partial coverage due to a paperwork error, a collections agency that had sent 3 notices and called every week. The fifth page showed that the combined wages from 3 jobs still weren't enough for Lila to cover rent, food, medication, and debt at the same time, and that she was 2 months behind on rent. Ronan finished the last page, folded the file, set it on the table beside his bed, and sat in silence for a long time while Sullivan waited in the corner of the room. Sullivan had seen his boss angry many times over 20 years, angry when territory was violated, angry when betrayed, angry when plans failed. But those angers were cold, controlled tools used to reach an outcome. The anger on Ronan's face now was different. It wasn't cold, it was hot. Hot in a raw, primitive way Sullivan had seen only once before, when Ronan was 14 standing over his father's body. It was the anger of a man who wanted to protect someone and couldn't accept that she had been hurt while he wasn't there. Ronan gave Sullivan 3 instructions in order, his voice calm, but every word carrying the weight of an unchangeable command. First, call the family's lawyers and have them pay off all of Lila Callahan's medical debt anonymously, without letting her know where the money came from, routing it through a charitable foundation or a medical assistance program so it looked legitimate. Sullivan nodded. Second, find Kyle Morrison and talk to him, not kill him, because Ronan knew a body creates investigations, and investigations create questions. Just talk clearly enough that Kyle would understand that if he contacted Lila or Thea even one more time, even by a single message, He'd wish he had never been born. Sullivan nodded again, and this time he almost smiled because this was the kind of work he did best. Third, if anyone or anything threatened Lila Callahan or her daughter from this moment forward, Sullivan was to handle it the same way he'd handle a direct threat to Ronan himself. Sullivan looked at his boss for 3 seconds and said he understood. 3 days later, Lila opened the mailbox in her apartment lobby and found an envelope from the collections agency. She was used to these envelopes, so used to them that her hands no longer shook when she opened them. Only a familiar dull ache she had learned to live with. But inside this time wasn't a payment demand. It was a notice stating that the entire $12,400 balance had been paid in full through a community medical assistance program, and her account was closed with a 0 balance. Lila read the letter twice, 3 times, then flipped it over as if the explanation had to be on the back, but there was nothing else. She didn't know which program it was, didn't remember applying for any assistance, but she didn't question it too deeply. Because when you're poor to the point of desperation, you accept miracles first and ask questions later. That same week in Yonkers, Kyle Morrison was drinking beer in his filthy apartment when there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Sullivan Reed standing there, not alone but with 2 other men. And Sullivan didn't say much because he never did. He handed Kyle a phone on speaker, and Ronan Vale's voice came through the line, slow and clear, saying exactly once what would happen if Kyle ever touched Lila's or Thea's life again. No one knows exactly what Ronan said because Sullivan never repeated it, but the outcome was clear. Kyle Morrison withdrew his custody petition the next day, deleted Lila's number, erased every means of contact, and left Yonkers within a week without telling anyone where he was going. Lila never received another message from Kyle, and she didn't understand why, but she didn't complain. She only let out a breath she had been holding and held Thea a little tighter that night. But the wall hadn't fallen completely. 1 week after Ronan woke, Lila was summoned to the hospital administration office. 2 managers sat behind a desk with stern faces and a file in front of them, and they said security cameras had recorded Lila bringing a small child into an intensive care patient's room on the night Ronan woke, that it was a serious violation of safety and sanitation policy, and they had no choice but to terminate her employment. Lila sat there listening, and she didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't explain, because she was too tired to beg anyone for anything anymore, and she only nodded and prepared to stand and leave when the phone on the desk rang. One manager answered, listened for 30 seconds, his face draining from stern to pale, then set the phone down and looked at his colleague with the expression of someone who had just realized he was standing in a minefield. The call was from the hospital's legal department, and the message was simple. The Vale family had donated more than $2 million to New York Presbyterian over the past 3 years, and the family's legal representative had just called to say that if an employee named Lila Callahan was affected in any way related to her job, the family would reconsider all future funding commitments. The 2 managers looked at each other, then at Lila, and the older one spoke in a completely different tone than a minute earlier, saying perhaps they had been a bit hasty and would review her case and that Lila could return to work as usual. Lila left the administration office without understanding what had just happened, without knowing why the storm had suddenly stopped, without knowing that a hand was moving in the shadows behind her life, quietly and methodically removing every threat. The hand of the man she had spoken to every night when he couldn't answer, and who was now answering in the only way he knew how. Ronan Vale was discharged from the hospital on a Tuesday morning, stepping into the black SUV waiting at the entrance with Sullivan opening the door and 2 escort vehicles positioned front and back, and the New York underworld understood that the wolf had returned. In the first week, Ronan summoned each capo one by one to his penthouse on the Upper East Side, not for a group meeting, but individually, because Ronan knew fear worked best when it was personal. Those who had remained loyal throughout the 3 weeks kept their positions and were generously rewarded. Those who had wavered were given a single chance to prove loyalty by returning everything they had taken while Ronan was in the hospital. As for the 3 allies who had switched sides to Voss, they received a call from Sullivan, and after that call, no one ever saw them appear at any negotiating table in the city again. Ronan reclaimed each territory methodically and with far greater ruthlessness than before he was shot, because before the shooting, he'd been ruthless simply because it was the only way he knew. But now he was ruthless because he had something to protect, and anyone who threatened that needed to understand the cost. Yet between closed-door meetings, thick with smoke where he decided other people's fates with a nod, between midnight calls where his voice was still cold as he issued orders, between moments when Ronan Vale was exactly the monster the underworld feared, he found himself thinking about Lila's voice. Not deliberately, but her voice surfaced unexpectedly in the middle of revenue reports or strategy briefings. Her voice talking about Thea pointing at the moon, about the one-eyed stuffed rabbit, about the way she had said, "I think maybe you needed to hear a voice that didn't ask anything from you." And every time that voice cut in, Ronan needed a few seconds to pull himself back into the room full of men waiting for his command. In the second week after his discharge, Ronan called the hospital to schedule a follow-up appointment. Sullivan looked at him with quiet confusion, but said nothing, because Ronan had private doctors who could come to the penthouse at any time, and both of them knew it. Ronan went to New York Presbyterian in the afternoon, met with Dr. Elena Hart for 30 minutes, listened as she said his recovery continued in ways she couldn't explain, and that he should return weekly. Then he left the clinic and slowed his steps as he passed the basement area where the janitorial staff was starting the evening shift. He saw Lila pushing her cleaning cart into the elevator, hair in a ponytail, light blue uniform, worn sneakers, and when she looked up and saw him standing at the end of the hallway, she stopped, one hand still on the cart handle, unsure whether to greet him or turn away. Ronan walked over with Sullivan 3 steps behind and said he wanted to speak with her. They sat in the hospital cafe on the ground floor, Ronan drinking black coffee, Lila ordering nothing because she didn't want him to pay for her, even for a cup of coffee. Ronan spoke directly without detours because he didn't know how to do detours. He said he was establishing a charitable organization, a real one, not a front, focused on providing child care support for night shift hospital workers and emergency assistance for single mother families. And he wanted Lila to run it. Triple her current salary, full medical insurance for her and Thea, and a 2-bedroom apartment in a safe area near good schools. Not a gift, but benefits attached to the executive director position. Lila listened and stayed silent for a long time, looking down at the table, and Ronan waited, which was unusual for him, but he waited for her. Then Lila looked up and met his gray eyes she now knew could be ice cold to the world, but had softened once in a hospital room in front of her. And she said no. She thanked him, but said no. She didn't accept charity. She had lived 27 years by her own labor and would continue to do so. She didn't want to owe anyone anything because she already owed too much in her life. And she said that if he wanted to help, then he should help people who needed it more, because at least she was still standing on her own 2 feet. Ronan looked at her after the refusal, and he wasn't angry. This nearly made Sullivan at the neighboring table drop his coffee, because in 20 years, anyone who had refused Ronan Vale had faced consequences. Not always violent, but never pleasant. And now, a janitor had just said no to his boss, and his boss was looking at her with what Sullivan could only describe as respect. Ronan nodded and said he understood, then stood up. And before leaving, he turned back and added that the offer would remain open whenever she changed her mind. Then he walked out of the hospital cafe with Sullivan following. And in the car on the way back to the penthouse, Sullivan glanced at his boss in the rearview mirror and saw Ronan Vale looking out the window with the corner of his mouth slightly curved. Not a smile, but almost one. And Sullivan thought that this was the first time in his life he had seen his boss rejected without wanting to destroy the person who rejected him. and perhaps that was a sign of something Sullivan had no word for other than change. The truth came looking for Lila on a Thursday evening 2 weeks after the meeting in the hospital cafe, in the basement staff break room where she was sitting with half a sandwich from home while waiting for her evening shift to start. The old television mounted on the wall was always tuned to the local news no one watched. But that night, Lila looked up because she heard a familiar name. On the screen was a breaking news segment. The reporter standing in front of the federal building at Foley Square with a ticker running below that said Ronan Vale, the notorious East Coast Mafia boss, had miraculously survived after 3 weeks in a coma, and that the FBI was increasing surveillance of the Vale family. Then his image appeared, not a hospital photo but an older one. Ronan in a black suit, stepping out of a courthouse with cold gray eyes staring straight into the camera, his face empty of expression. Sullivan Reed holding an umbrella behind him, while the reporter talked about the Vale criminal empire, about extortion and money laundering allegations that had never quite been enough to prosecute, about the assassination attempt outside a Lower Manhattan restaurant, about how his mysterious awakening had shocked both law enforcement and the underworld. The half sandwich slipped from Lila's hand and she didn't pick it up. She sat there staring at the screen without blinking as the reporter continued listing what Ronan Vale was accused of having done: the people hurt, the businesses squeezed, the neighborhoods living in fear under his family's control. And each word landed like a punch to Lila's chest because she realized that the man she had spoken to every night, the man she had prayed for, the man she had cried over when she thought he was dying, the man her daughter had slept on, wasn't some unlucky anonymous patient, but one of the most dangerous men in the city. Shock came first, an icy wash from the top of her head to her feet, the kind of cold that made Lila grip the edge of the chair so she wouldn't fall. Then fear followed. Fear for herself and fear for Thea, because she had carried her daughter into the hospital room of a mafia boss, had let her child sleep on the chest of a man guarded by armed security, while she had foolishly assumed it was because he was wealthy rather than because he was dangerous. Then anger arrived, hot and sharp, replacing fear, because Lila felt deceived, felt her kindness had been used, even if she didn't yet understand how, felt she had opened herself and poured out her deepest secrets and pain to someone she hadn't known at all, and that he had sat across from her drinking coffee without saying a word about the truth. Lila didn't wait for the next follow-up appointment. She asked Evelyn about Ronan's old room, learned he had already been discharged, and then did something she had never imagined she would do. She used the phone number Ronan had left when he offered her the job, and she called. Sullivan answered, and Lila said in a voice shaking with anger rather than fear that she needed to see Ronan Vale right now. 2 hours later, they were sitting across from each other in the hospital cafe, the same table as before. But this time, Lila wasn't polite and she wasn't gentle. She looked straight into his eyes and said she had seen the news, that she knew who he was now, that she had been stupid to tell a mafia boss about her daughter, about where she lived, about her fears, that she didn't want any connection to his world, not even a single strand. That her daughter was everything she had in this world, and she wouldn't let Thea be put in danger for anyone. And she told him to forget her, forget Thea, forget the voice from those nights, because Lila Callahan didn't belong in Ronan Vale's world. Ronan listened without interrupting, without frowning, without turning cold. And when Lila finished, the cafe sat in heavy silence between them for a long moment. Then Ronan spoke. And it wasn't the voice of a boss issuing orders, but a voice Lila had never heard before. A voice fractured at the edges of every word. The voice of a man saying something he had never said to anyone and likely never would again. Telling her she was the only person who had spoken to him while he lay there. Not because of who he was, because she hadn't known who he was. That she spoke to him because of who she was. Because she believed the soul could hear what the body couldn't, because she told moon stories to a dying stranger, because where the rest of the world saw only power or a threat, she saw a lonely man who had never truly lived, that in 36 years, no one had ever looked at him that way, not a single person, that she was the only one, and that he was asking her not to take that away. Ronan said nothing more. He placed money for the coffee on the table, even though neither of them had drunk anything, then stood and left with Sullivan following, and Lila stayed behind alone in the hospital cafe, staring at the empty chair across from her. She left 10 minutes later and went to clean rooms on the evening shift like every other day, and she didn't call Ronan that night or the next day or the day after that, but his words wouldn't leave her. They followed her onto the bus back to the Bronx, followed her into the studio apartment, followed her into bed where she lay beside Thea, sleeping with the one-eyed stuffed rabbit in her arms. "You are the only one." Lila closed her eyes and saw those gray eyes, not the cold eyes from the television, but the broken eyes from the cafe, the eyes of a 14-year-old orphan still hiding inside a 36-year-old kingpin. And she understood she was angry at him for the truth, but couldn't hate him for the pain, because Lila Callahan knew what loneliness looked like. And it didn't change whether you lived in a Bronx studio or an Upper East Side penthouse. Hector Voss didn't become the Southern boss by overlooking details. From the moment Ronan woke up, Voss had men tracking every move his rival made, and it didn't take long for an unusual report to surface. Ronan Vale, a man who never saw the same woman twice, had met a hospital janitor twice in 2 weeks, and both times the boss had gone without his full security detail, only Sullivan at his side, as if he didn't want to frighten her. Voss dug deeper, and within days he had a name, an address, a work schedule, and grainy photos of Lila pushing Thea's stroller along Grand Concourse. And he smiled, because in 30 years of this life, he had learned that no matter how powerful a man was, he always had a weakness. And Ronan Vale's weakness wasn't an empire or territory or money. It was a thin janitor and her small daughter. Lila sensed something was wrong on the third night. The black sedan parked across the street from her building, headlights still on, appeared at 10 at night when she came home from her shift and was still there at 4 in the morning when she woke to feed Thea. The first night, she told herself it was a neighbor's guest. The second night, unease crept in. The third night, she stood behind the curtain and saw the red glow of a cigarette inside the car and knew someone was sitting there watching her window. She closed the curtain, locked the door twice, slid the safety bolt, then sat on the bed holding Thea, and didn't sleep until dawn. She wanted to believe she was being paranoid, that this was New York and cars parked overnight all the time. But her gut knew this wasn't normal. The same gut that had warned her about Kyle before her mind caught up, and she hadn't listened then. So this time, she listened. Then came the 7th night. Lila came home close to midnight after her shift, carrying Thea asleep from Mrs. Park's place, opened the apartment door, turned on the light, and knew immediately someone had been inside. Not because anything was disturbed or a lock was broken. Everything looked normal. But there was the faint smell of unfamiliar men's cologne in a room that usually smelled only of baby milk and cleaning solution. And she knew it wasn't hers, wasn't Mrs. Park's, wasn't anyone who had ever belonged in that apartment. Then she saw it. On Thea's pillow where her daughter slept every night beside the one-eyed stuffed rabbit lay a single red rose, placed perfectly in the center. Petals fresh, stem neatly cut like it came from an expensive florist. There was no card, no note. None was needed, because the message was clearer than any threat. "We know where your daughter sleeps. We can enter your home whenever we want. And next time, it might not be a flower." Lila looked at the rose, and her body reacted before her mind could. Her knees buckled, her arms clutched Thea so tightly the child woke and began to cry. And Lila ran into the bathroom, the only room with a lock, shut the door, slid to the cold tile floor with her back against the tub, and held Thea while they both cried. She sat there for an hour, shaking uncontrollably until Thea finally cried herself back to sleep against her chest. And in the darkness, Lila thought through every option she had. Call the police and say what? That someone left a flower on my child's pillow. They'd laugh at her. Move away. But where and with what? Money. Run. But run to where? When she had no family, no friends, no one in the world except the child sleeping against her. Then she thought of Ronan. She thought of what he had said in the cafe. She thought of those fractured eyes, and she hated herself for what she was about to do. But she did it because she was a mother, and mothers do whatever they must. Lila pulled out her phone with shaking hands and called the only number she had. Sullivan answered on the first ring like always, and Lila said in a voice she tried to steady and failed, "Someone's been in my apartment. Someone left a flower on my child's pillow. I need help." Sullivan didn't ask a single question. He just said, "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone." 15 minutes. Exactly 15 minutes later, there was a knock, and Sullivan's voice said, "It's me." Lila opened the door, and Sullivan stood there with two other men. One immediately swept the apartment while the other stood guard in the hallway, and Sullivan looked at the rose on the pillow, looked at Lila's face, then said, "Leave now. Take what the child needs. Don't bring anything else." 20 minutes later, Lila sat in the back seat of a black SUV, holding Thea wrapped in a blanket, watching the city slide past the window in the night. And she didn't know where they were going until the car stopped in front of a high-rise on the Upper East Side, and Sullivan led her into a private elevator straight to the top floor. The elevator doors opened onto the penthouse, and Ronan stood there. No suit, no Dawn persona. Just a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up and dark trousers, hair uncombed, eyes showing he hadn't slept either, though it was nearly 2 in the morning. He looked at Lila stepping out with Thea in her arms, face drained of color, eyes swollen red, hands still shaking, and the child curled against her chest, clutching the one-eyed rabbit in restless sleep. And something on Ronan's face broke. Not softened like in the hospital room, not fractured like in the cafe, but shattered completely, like a wall he had built over 22 years since his father died, collapsing in a single instant at the sight of a woman, trembling with her child because his world had touched her life. Ronan stepped forward, didn't touch Lila because he knew she wasn't ready for that, but stood close enough for her to know he was there. And he said to Sullivan in a voice that wasn't loud but carried the weight of stone in every word, "Find Voss. End this." Sullivan nodded once and stepped back into the elevator. And in the weeks that followed, Hector Voss's network was dismantled piece by piece in ways only the underworld ever learned the details of. No one spoke of what finally happened to Voss. No one asked. And when his name stopped appearing in any conversation, in any bar or nightclub in the city, everyone understood that Ronan Vale had proven once again why he was the boss, and that anyone who touched what he protected would pay, not with territory or money, but with everything. A week after Voss vanished from the underworld map, Declan Vale came to Ronan's penthouse on a Sunday afternoon, not to discuss strategy or sign papers, but because Ronan had called and said his brother should come for dinner. Just that. And Declan came because it was the first time in more than 10 years Ronan had invited him without an agenda. They sat in the wide living room overlooking Central Park with 2 glasses of whiskey on the table. And for the first time in a very long while, the 2 brothers talked like brothers instead of twin pillars of an empire trying not to collapse. Declan said that the night before the 72 hours ended, after he signed the papers to remove the ventilator and finish the meeting with the capos, he drove home, parked in the garage, shut off the engine, and sat in the dark for 3 hours. He said he cried, for the first time since their father's funeral 22 years earlier. Cried not because he feared losing the empire, but because he realized he was about to let his brother die without the 2 of them ever having said a single truly important thing to each other beyond numbers and strategy. Ronan listened and didn't know how to respond, because the Vale family hadn't taught its sons how to answer honesty. But he put a hand on Declan's shoulder and held it there, and Declan put his hand over his brother's. And then the two men who had been hard their entire lives hugged for the first time since standing beside their father's coffin, a brief and awkward embrace in the way of men who weren't used to holding anyone, but real, more real than any handshake or nod they had shared in 20 years. Declan left at 9 in the evening, and when the elevator doors closed, the penthouse returned to 3 people: Ronan, Lila, and Thea. Lila and Thea had been there for more than a week since the night of the flower on the pillow. Ronan had given them a private guest suite with a locking door so Lila would feel safe, and he kept a respectful distance, never entering when the door was closed, never touching Lila or Thea unless invited. But Thea didn't understand distance. She was nearly 2, and the penthouse was the most magical kingdom her small feet had ever explored. She ran everywhere, touching everything with the fearless curiosity of a child who didn't yet know the world could hurt her. And that evening, while Lila washed dishes in the kitchen, Thea found Ronan. He was sitting alone on the terrace overlooking the city, his second glass of whiskey in hand, Manhattan lights reflected in his gray eyes, thinking about his conversation with Declan, about wasted years, about words never spoken. When he heard tiny footsteps padding across the stone floor, Thea stood in the doorway looking at him with wide eyes, the one-eyed stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, and she wasn't shy or afraid. She simply walked straight to Ronan and climbed into his lap with the natural ease of a child who believed every set of arms was a safe place. Ronan froze. He set the whiskey down too quickly and didn't know what to do with his arms. Hands that had held guns, struck blows, signed orders of destruction, now being grabbed by a child not yet 2 years old, tugging at his index finger. Thea held his hand, pulled it toward the sky, pointed up, and said in a small, clear, proud voice, "Luna." The moon hung over New York, not full, just a thin crescent. But Thea looked at it as if it were the most beautiful thing in the universe, then turned back to Ronan, waiting for confirmation, waiting for him to say, "Yes, that's the moon." Because that was how she shared joy with the adults in her life. Ronan looked down at the tiny face lifted toward him and didn't know what to do with this gentleness or where to place it in a life built of violence and shadow. But he heard himself say softly, "Luna." And Thea laughed, the way children laugh when an adult understands them. Then she rested her head against his chest and sat quietly watching the moon, holding his finger and not letting go. Lila stood in the darkness behind the glass door, her hands still wet with dishwater, and she saw everything. She saw the most powerful Mafia boss on the East Coast sitting perfectly still on the terrace for fear a sudden movement might startle the child on his lap. She saw hands that had killed cradling her daughter's tiny fingers. And she saw the real person behind Ronan Vale, the 14-year-old orphan who had never been held and had become a monster to survive, now being taught by a stranger's child how to touch the world without destroying it. In the days that followed, affection grew among the 3 of them at the slow pace of the moon changing shape each night. Ronan cooked pasta for Thea at 2 in the morning when she woke hungry, standing in his $1 million kitchen, boiling noodles in a pot he had to Google how to use because he had never cooked anything himself before. He read to Thea every night at bedtime, his voice stiff and awkward because he wasn't used to reading aloud. But Thea didn't care whether the voice was good or bad. She just needed someone there. And he read until she fell asleep and then kept reading a few more pages because he didn't want to stop. Some nights Lila and Ronan sat in the kitchen drinking coffee after Thea slept, their hands accidentally brushing when they reached for the pot at the same time, both pulling back at once and pretending nothing had happened, though both knew something had, and neither was ready to name it. Then one night, Thea said his name in her sleep. She lay in the crib in the guest room, hugging the one-eyed rabbit, eyes closed, and the word Ronan slipped from her small lips in a dreamy whisper. natural and easy, as if the name belonged in her safe vocabulary alongside Mama and Luna. Ronan was standing in the doorway checking on her before bed, a habit he couldn't remember when he had started, and he heard his name from the mouth of a sleeping child and stood there a long time without moving. Then tears ran down his face, not many, just 2, one on each side, but they were the first tears Ronan Vale had shed since the day his father died, and he let them fall because no one was watching. But Lila saw. She stood in the hallway behind him and saw the tears on the cheeks of the man the underworld feared, and she said nothing, didn't wipe them away or touch him. She simply stepped forward and sat beside him on the floor outside Thea's room, her shoulder against his, and she sat there in silence, and Ronan sat there in silence, and together they watched the child sleep through the cracked door, and no one spoke because there was nothing that needed saying, and that was enough. In the months that followed, Ronan Vale did something no one in the underworld thought he ever would. He began to walk away from it, not abruptly or naively, because Ronan understood an empire built on blood couldn't be dismantled overnight. But he started redirecting each segment toward legitimacy, real estate that was truly real instead of laundering money through property, restaurants that made honest profit instead of serving as fronts, investments in technology and healthcare instead of in dark corridors. Declan was the first to notice the shift, and for the first time in his life, he looked at his younger brother, not with worry, but with hope, then rolled up his sleeves and did what he did best, turning vision into numbers. What surprised Sullivan and Declan and everyone around Ronan even more than the legalization of the empire was the charity. Ronan founded it with his own clean money, not shadow funds, named it the Luna Foundation, and defined its mission with the same clarity he used when giving orders: to build free childcare systems inside hospitals for night shift workers. So no mother would ever have to bring a sick child to work because there was no one to watch them, to provide emergency support for single mother families on the brink, and to run domestic violence prevention programs to help women like Lila find a way out before it was too late. When Ronan offered Lila the role of executive director for the second time, she didn't refuse, not because her circumstances had changed or because she had softened toward money, but because this time she understood it wasn't charity. It was a mission she believed in, a mission written in her own life. In nights carrying a sick child to work because there was no one to help, in moments backed into corners with no rescue. And she told Ronan she accepted because she wanted to make sure no mother ever had to live what she had lived. And Ronan nodded because he didn't need any other reason. 6 months after Ronan Vale opened his eyes in a hospital bed, he stood in the new office of the Luna Foundation, a renovated warehouse in Brooklyn, chosen because it sat in the heart of the community the foundation served, rather than inside a glass tower in Manhattan, detached from reality. The warehouse walls were covered with children's drawings from the neighborhood, photographs of families the foundation had helped. And at the center of the largest wall was a mural Lila had completed with the children over the past month. A star-filled night sky with a large golden moon at its center, surrounded by hundreds of small, colorful handprints from children who had pressed their hands to the wall and left their mark on the world. Thea ran through the office, tiny feet pattering across the polished concrete floor, the one-eyed stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm as always, and she ran straight to Ronan, grabbed his hand and pulled him along because she had something important to show. Ronan let her lead, his long stride slowing to match her small steps, and Thea stopped in front of the mural, pointed to a small blue handprint just to the left of the moon, and said with the most serious voice a nearly 2-year-old could manage, "That's Thea." Ronan knelt to her eye level, looked at the tiny handprint on the wall, then at Thea and said, "It's beautiful, just like you." Lila stood on the other side of the room watching them, her heart so full she had to breathe deeply. In 6 months, they had hired a 12-person team, built childcare systems in 5 hospitals, provided emergency support to more than 300 families, and they were only getting started. but more than the numbers, they had become a family. Not a traditional family, not one anyone would have predicted, but a real one built from late-night pasta cooking, bedtime stories, shoulders touching in silence outside a sleeping child's room. Ronan looked up at Lila across the room, and between them was the invisible thread her grandmother had taught her about when she was little. The thread she now knew was real. Then Ronan called out, "Come here. Thea says we all have to put our handprints on the wall." The three of them stood before the mural. Lila opened the paint box, and one by one they dipped their hands into the paint and pressed them onto the wall beside the golden moon. Thea's tiny blue handprint was already there. Lila's handprint was smaller than Ronan's, slender fingers pressed in silver. Ronan's handprint was the largest, pressed in dark gray. The same hand still marked with calluses from years of holding guns, now smeared with paint, and the laughter of a nearly 2-year-old clapping when she saw the grown-ups follow her lead. 3 handprints of different sizes lay side by side, overlapping slightly at the edges, forming their own small constellation on the wall among hundreds of others. But these 3 belonged together in a way that didn't need explaining. Thea looked up at the mural, saw the large golden moon in the painted night sky, and pointed up saying, "Luna," in the same voice that 6 months earlier had reached a man lost in a coma and kept him from drifting away. Ronan and Lila answered Luna together, then looked at each other and smiled, a soft smile shared by 2 people who had walked through too much darkness not to cherish every fragment of light, no matter how small. And they stood there beneath a painted sky full of stars and dreams, 3 souls who had found each other in the dark and pulled one another into the light, hand in hand, ready to spend the rest of their lives helping others find their own constellation in the night. Because sometimes the most miraculous magic doesn't come from medicine or money or power, but from the simplest and most revolutionary act of all, treating one another with kindness. We're all connected by invisible threads. And when you tug gently on one, somewhere someone will feel it, and if you're lucky, they'll tug back. This story reminds us that kindness is never wasted, no matter who you give it to. That compassion has the power to heal wounds the entire world can't fix. That no one is too rich to need love, and no one is too poor to give it. And that true family isn't always defined by blood, but is sometimes born from the most unexpected moments when 2 strangers decide to care about each other without needing a reason. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever met someone whose kindness changed your life? Or have you ever been that person for someone else without even knowing it? Share your story in the comments below because we always read them and we truly want to listen to what's in your hearts. If this story touched you, please like it, share it with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so each day you can find more meaningful stories walking alongside you. We sincerely thank you for staying with us until the very end. Wish all of you watching good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.